So good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Rudy Kraus, and I'm one of the co-founders, corporate psychologist, and the CEO here at Compono. Just very briefly on Compono, we're a company that cares about how people work, and we're a proud sponsor of ARI. Now, for today, we're extremely fortunate to be joined by sporting legend Ben Ikin, who will share with us his lessons learned on how to build winning cultures on the field and in the workplace. So welcome, Ben, and thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Rudy. It's been a pleasure to get to know you, and I'm looking forward to our deep dive into all things culture.
Me too, mate. Me too. So look, guys, by way of background, Ben is currently the football and performance director at the Brisbane Broncos. He's played 150 professional games in the NRL, represented Queensland 17 times at the State of Origin, played 2 tests for Australia, and he still holds the record as the youngest player ever to play at the State of Origin. I'm surprised you can still walk, Ben, if I'm honest.
But I don't do it well, Rudy. I don't do it well, trust me.
Apart from that, Ben was also part of the Brisbane Broncos premiership winning team in 2000, and he's renowned in football circles as having great footy intellect and has launched himself into a very successful media career where he became a regular panelist on Channel 9's The Sunday Roast. Is there anything this man can't do? Well, I specifically wanted to do a webinar with Ben after seeing his incredibly engaging and inspiring keynote presentation about team culture, competence, and performance, and specifically what the corporate world can learn from elite sports and how people must be at the center of your business in order for it to thrive. So much to unpack, so little time. So Ben, if you're ready, should we dive into it?
Absolutely. Let's go.
Okay. So great. Okay. I think, let's start off with your career. Let's start a little bit broad. I think, you've had a very interesting career, from professional athlete to sales and marketing, board directorships, television host, commentator, and now, of course, sports administration. Did you ever think your career would have so many facets, and was this all neatly planned out?
Well, it wasn't planned, and I should have expected that it would have multiple facets because I'm easily distracted. I can go down rabbit holes, and so I kind of get wholly engaged in doing things, become very obsessed, and then eventually whatever it is I'm doing, whether that's a job or a project, ends up having a bit of a lifespan, and then I find myself popping my head up and having a look around for the next thing. So I've never had a career plan. I've only ever just dived in, boots and all, into whatever it is that I was doing at the time, try to do it as well as I possibly can. So whoever was employing me would keep inviting me back, hopefully pay me well along the way. And then, as I said, once the boredom kicks in, or the job or the project ceases to have a challenge, I'll start to have a look around. But there's never been a kind of a career plan as such.
But let's face it, whatever you put your hands to, you do it 100%, right?
Well, I do. And that's, people often ask me, do I love what I do? And I don't. I'm not a passionate guy. I'm very objective by nature. I guess what I've learned to do, which is I think it's helped me enormously, is less fall in love with what I'm doing and more fall in love with doing what I'm doing well. So the whole kind of quest to develop excellence in a role, or, push for excellence in the organisation that I'm working in, has kind of been more of my focus than being passionate about what I do.
Perfect. Makes sense to me. So I think that kind of leads in quite nicely into, I think understanding, take us into your world at the Brisbane Broncos. How is it structured? What is it that you're responsible for in your role? And how is that different to, what you've previously faced?
So I effectively oversee the football program. So the men's football program, which this is the frame I use to sort of manage my day-to-day, week-to-week, season-to-season. We're a $22 million business inside of a $60 million organisation. So that thing you see on the screen there is our NRL football program. It has multiple components or business units inside of it. Someone's probably already guessed on the webinar today that I like to take a systems lens to my work. So for me, having a deep understanding of what the football program is in terms of that systems lens is important. So what the parts are, how they connect. As you can see there, that thing in front of you costs 22 million. It's 30 odd staff, 36 players. The players sit at the centre of the experience, and then ring fencing the players. The 6 key business units: athletic performance, which you would know as strength and conditioning; the coaching element, which is Kevy and his assistant coaches. They focus on the football component. We've got a medical team of 4 physios and doctors. We've got a roster management team, which also oversees pathways, which is developing our next generation of talent and then building our top 30 list, all under the salary cap, of course. A wellbeing team led by an ex-SAS soldier, supported by an ex-Muay Thai champion, who are both experts in their field. They focus on the mental and social elements. And then I sit in the operations area. So from a project management, program management perspective, my goal is to make this thing efficient, effective, run on time and on budget. So that's my org chart that you're seeing right now.
You took the words out of my mouth. I think it's quite interesting because it's a very different representation of what you would normally see from an organizational chart, being quite, silos in the different functions. Now, I can't help but notice that right in the middle is this player experience. And if I think about it from a corporate world, in many ways, that's, the people in the organization. So can you talk a little bit about, how this organizational chart has that strong focus right at the center with player experience at it?
Well, look, Jack Gibson, who's one of our most famous coaches, said way back in the early 80s that the best coaches are the best recruiters. And Wayne Bennett will tell you that players make coaches, not the other way around, because ultimately what you're trying to do is recruit and retain the best players you can to win premierships. And once you get through the recruitment process and you get your list of players, is you are then trying to give them the best possible experience you can, because the future of all the people that sit in those parts that ring fence the players is wholly dependent on what that group in the middle does on a Sunday afternoon. So you're trying to create a player experience, as you can see there, I've listed it out, that's educative, so they're learning and growing. It's definitive, so they can be clear and ultimately committed, supportive, so they feel like you've got their back. And it's got to be fun, because we play a brutal collision sport that requires a certain psychology. Preparing to play it is really hard. Playing the game is even harder. And the other part for us around making sure the player experience is great, so they're learning, growing and winning, is that we operate in this financially constrained environment under this thing called a salary cap. And so you're limited to what you can pay your recruits. So what you're constantly trying to do is get good players to stay for less. And you do that because they have a great experience. And part of that experience, as I've mapped out there, is that they're learning, they feel like they're getting better, they're growing as people and footballers, and ultimately they're winning more games than they lose, and hopefully a few premierships along the way. And then you've created this environment that players find really difficult to leave, so they'll stay for less. And other players, as has been evidenced by the Melbourne Storm in the past, they want to go to those sorts of organisations because they know they're going to grow and win.
So I find this really interesting, Rod, because it's so easy for corporate world, especially from an organisation structure perspective, to each of those functions really do operate as a silo, right? So it's very easy for those functions to go down that path. How does your leadership team prevent that from happening? How does your leadership team make sure that the player experience is truly at the center of, medical, roster management, well-being? Is there a specific ethos, or is there a specific way you guys manage each of those functions to focus on player, or how do you do that?
Well, listen, if you know anything about me now, I've got a process or a framework that needs to capture everything, which, as you can see outside of the straight org chart, there are other elements that sit in the system. So each of those departments that sit around the players have a leader, and we meet as a leadership team, and our focus is on that player experience, that work environment, which, you know, a large part is focused on culture. And so culture is represented by the four elements that sit on the outside that are connected by the straight line. So the vision, what we're trying to do here, why we're doing it. For us, the organisational vision is to be a world-class organisation. So our part of that is to be a world-class athletic program, or football program more specifically. We have values at our club that we want to live by, as most organisations do. When we ask the question, we do it a little differently. So it's not so much how we want others to see us from the outside. It's about what do we value in our people. And when you ask the question that way, you tend to get a more accurate reflection of what's required to fulfill your vision. For us, our values, or trademarks as we call them, respect, resilience, compete, and mateship. But respect and resilience effectively capture the other two. So we want our players to respect the opportunity, respect the history of the club, respect the fact that they get well paid to do what they do. So respect the opportunity, respect the fans that invest in the club, that love to watch us and engage with us. And resilience is very much about how we want to approach our preparation and performance. That then is also underpinned by our standards. So, you know, we want a list of rules, if you want to call them. We don't use the word rules, that the players have to buy into, that we believe create the culture that aligns with our values. And then there's a system that sits at the bottom there that underpins it. So to go into a bit more detail, we've got 6 standards that, you know, effectively relate to performance and brand. And then the system is, if you break any of the rules that effectively are our standards, there is a sanction. For an individual, we get through 10 group sanctions and have a whole of team sanction to know that this is a team. We remind them of that. And then over time, because we are deliberately holding our people to account, and this applies to staff and players, to the standards that underpin the values that are going to get us our vision, is that our culture then happens on purpose. It's not some sort of happy accident. Because at the end, I mean, everybody's got a different definition of culture, but for us here, and for me specifically, culture is nothing more than the sum total of the behaviours that you reward and reject. We don't do that here. That's not acceptable, or that's great, keep doing more of that. And if you are consistently rewarding and reprimanding the things you want and don't want, then over time, that builds momentum, and you get to the ultimate outcome, which is having a player-led culture.
I really love how you talk about it. It's kind of like the outside in, inside out model, right? From the outside in, you've got your vision, your standards, accountability, you know, driving, you know, your functions to then essentially have the outcome, which is, you know, the player experience. But by the sounds of it, you started off by saying, you know, a coach doesn't make the players make the coach, right? So I quite like that mentality of a true systems approach. So I guess talk a little bit more around, you know, how you define culture. Now, I know you said it's the sum of what you allow, what you don't allow, but, you know, how does that relate to the organization's objectives and what it's trying to achieve, right? So how do you personally define culture? And the reason why I'm so interested in this topic is because I think in corporate world, culture is thrown about, you know, in boardrooms, in team meetings and so forth. And I think very rarely is it truly understood. So, I mean, from your perspective and the way Broncos think about it, how do you define it?
It has to be authentic, Rudy. You know, like I said before, we play a brutal collision sport that requires a certain psychology. You need to tick a bit different to do what our players do. And the mindset of the person who plays the brutal collision sport and the culture that's required to support that, it doesn't reconcile well with polite society. And so, you know, you can see in the middle there, I've got some other elements: leadership, connection, capability, and knowledge flow. The leadership element in this is so vitally important. So we all go on this professional development journey. We're all trying to grow and improve. It starts with us, then eventually you'll get to a position in your career where you need to move beyond the self and apply it to a team or an organisation. This thing that you're seeing on the screen here, it has many parts, and I've taken deep dives into each of them around process and methodology. There's a lot of science and data that backs what we do, but ultimately that thing you see on the screen there, it has to be led. You need a leader that understands what's required to be great at what it is that you want to do. And as I said before, in our world, it's brutal collision sport, which requires a certain style of person. So the leader comes in. Our leader is Kev Walters. He's our head coach. And so it's the job of the leader then to understand what his team needs to do week to week from a performance and preparation perspective, and what sort of culture is required to do that thing great. So again, to be great at a brutal collision sport means you need a certain type of person doing certain type of things. And so once you understand what those things are, the behaviours that you need and the behaviours that you don't want. So other things we don't want are, we don't want selfishness. You know, there's a list of these things. It's for the leader then to determine what he's going to reprimand and what he's going to reward to get the culture he needs to be great at the industry that he's working in with his team of players. For the rest of us, Kevy will have his own unique way of getting that done. It will be different from Wayne Bennett. It will be different from Craig Bellamy. It will be different from Bill Belichick. It'll be different from Steve Kerr. It'll be different from Anthony Albanese. You know, Kevy has his own leadership style, which is based on his personal values and his idea about how he wants to win football games. And so it's for him then to work with us to make what he needs very, very clear, put his stake in the ground. And that requires, you know, I guess a deep level of self-awareness. It also requires a whole stack of courage and, you know, also a level of consideration, so that once he knows who he is and what he stands for and what's required from his people, both the staff and the players, is then he puts that stake in the ground and goes after it every day. And culture these days is getting harder and harder to be specific, because we have a generation of people who are turning up to work expecting the organisation to mould themselves to the individual. And if they don't get what they need, if they don't feel inspired every day, then they can disengage and become toxic. So it takes a lot of courage from the leader to know who he or she is, what he or she stands for, and then put your stake in the ground and communicate that and hold the rest of the organisation to account on that. Culture is not easy. It has to be deliberate, and it takes courage.
I really like that, right? Because I think many organizations, even some of the ones we talk to, right, there's the expectation that, you know, HR is responsible for culture. And I like the way you've actually articulated it in terms of, you know, it's got to be driven from the top. You know, I've got the saying, a fish starts rotting from the head, right? And I think that really applies to this. And I think the other part that really resonates with me is, you know, in corporate world, you know, the definition or the way people talk about culture typically is the way we do things around here. But using your words, you know, what you allow, what you don't allow in order for the team to achieve means that there's a second half to that equation, a second half to that definition that is actually missing. So for me, the way you've spoken about it is the way we do things around here in pursuit of our goals and objectives, because otherwise the way we do things around here means nothing, right? And I think that's a lot of the times is a challenge when we talk about culture. People just say, oh, It's what happens around the water cooler. Yeah, sure, it happens around the water cooler, but is that actually aligned with what we're trying to achieve?
And on purpose, Rudy, and that's the courageous part is, it's good if your good culture is a happy accident, well done, you've got lucky, but generally doesn't happen that way. So how we do things around here has to be supported by, I guess, some behaviours that are acceptable and unacceptable made really explicit. And then the courage part is the hard part of culture. It's also the hard part of leadership, because when you see something that you don't want, because that's not how we do things around here, you have to call it out.
Yeah.
You have to have the tough conversation. You have to respectfully part company with the person, because in this kind of systems theory as it applies to the work environment in my world, the great lesson for me is that the output of a system is determined less by the quality of the parts and more by the strength of the relationship between the parts. So one focuses on capability and the other part is connection, which you can see here in my frame. Capability is important, okay? To do something great, you need great people who do great things. But know this, is that if connection is poor and capability is high, things will get real toxic real quick. And so the leadership element of striking this right balance between capability and connection, about focusing on the strength of the relationship between the parts, not just the quality of the parts, means that the leader or the leaders have to make sure that they are calling out things that are going to diminish connection. And then that then spills into, we've got a roster management component, which is recruitment. It's not just for players, it's for staff, is that, yes, we want capable people. Yes, we want quality characters, but more than anything, what we want is people who are compatible, to bring them into our organisation to work for our leader and leadership team because they align with our values. And you are not a bad person if you come to our place and you don't fit. But if we figure out that you do, if we can't get you to drink the Kool-Aid, then we've got to have a conversation. Yeah. It gets to the point in our world where you have to make a decision. Can I coach this person or do I have to cut them? All for the sake of good culture.
So I really like that. I mean, I can go many different ways here, but I think you touched on team composition, recruitment and selection, right? So what is it that you look for? How do you ensure you bring the right players into the club? For me, I mean, to be the best, the club demands the best, right? So is it always about finding the superstars or the individuals with the outstanding technical capabilities? Or what is it that you look for to essentially build that culture, drive the team forward? Or is it just, we just want the best footy players?
It's a bit of both. As I said before, we have the three categories. It's competence, can they play? Character, are they a good person? And the third and more important category is compatibility. Do they fit? We've had players, and some players get through here and you don't find until after the fact that they're not compatible. And it's not always about their character. Sometimes it's about, okay, we've ended up with three left edge back rowers here that all play the same way. So not compatible, because it's thrown our roster out of balance. We've got 9.5 million or 12 million now under the new CBA to spend on 30 players. That money needs to be deployed really cleverly. So, as you can imagine, we've done a whole lot of data analytics on what the key criteria are to make sure that your roster has balance across any number of areas. So you're looking at things like strike, management, toughness, endurance, leadership, experience. You can't have it all. You need to tick a lot of boxes, but you only got 12 million to do it. And everybody's spending the same 12 million. So for us, when we go into the market, yes, we're looking for players by position. We have a whole stack of coding that sits in behind what we do when we go to market to determine how players rate by position. And then we get to the compatibility piece at some point. Do we need that player in that position? Are they too similar to someone else we've got on the list? Are we too old at the moment? Do we need some youth? And the character test is still very old-fashioned. Someone like me and the head of recruitment crunches all the numbers and looks at where the roster is sitting at the moment. And then, Melbourne are probably the most systemised sporting organisation or football program in the country. It still ends with a player sitting down and having a coffee with Craig Bellamy, as is the case here with our head coach, Kevy Walters. It needs to feel good at the end for it to happen. And you've got to know this, is that nobody gets it right all the time. And if you do get it wrong, have the tough conversation.
So in terms of your culture and so forth, in the corporate world, we obviously call it, giving candidates a realistic preview. I know you just mentioned that you sit down with the coach and you'll have a coffee. In corporate world, we kind of sometimes say, that creates a lot of bias and a lot of issues because, it's the whole beer test. Is Ben the kind of guy I want to have a beer with at the end of the day? So how do you align or communicate and talk to, a potential player around what the culture is of the organization, what it is you're looking for, and what the specific person characteristics are that, makes up not only a superstar, but makes up a good team player?
Rudy, there has to be a bias at some point for compatibility to be properly considered. There has to be a bias. My job is to build a roster, not for some mythical coach that can coach all players in all conditions all of the time. I have to recruit for the head coach I've got. So I have to know and understand what he stands for, how he likes to coach, what type of players are going to adapt best and thrive best under his coaching style, how he likes his team to play. We call that our game model these days, and what type of players we need to bring that game model to life. It is all biased towards, the most important people in your program. Not only that, I have to consider, we've got a guy here called Adam Reynolds, who's like the brains of our team, there's no point me bringing someone in that's not going to be compatible to the way that our halfback and captain wants to play. That just creates friction. I've learned over time, and this is something that was sort of rammed home for me working in the media, is that if you try to be all things to all people, you end up nothing to no one, which comes back to that point I made before about courage. You need to put your stake in the ground. If you want to be great, you need to attract other people to your cause who believe in the same things. And just because someone comes into your organisation and they don't buy it doesn't make them a bad person. It just makes them a bad fit.
I think I really like what you've said, right? Because even, for Component and what we tell our customers, right, we talk about diversity a lot lately, right? And the way we talk about it is, less diversity or talking about diversity around factors like race, religion, and so forth, but more around diversity of thought, but within the realms of having a very clear identity of the organization. So in other words, being very clear around what the company stands for, what the purpose is, what the values is. In other words, looking at your model, what the culture is, and using that element as a way or a benchmark to screen people in and screen people out that, necessarily might not fit your organization. So I think the way I talk about bias is less around, the corporate word of cognitive bias, but more around benchmarking what good looks like for a company. And by the sounds of it, the Broncos and the way you operate really plays into that piece as well. So I think, let's talk about, you've made a hiring mistake, right? So, the recruitment process didn't quite go as planned. How do you move someone on, especially if they consider, a superstar player? When's the best time to have that conversation? Is it now? Is it later? Do you try work with this person? I think this is a big problem for recruitment in general, for corporate world, right? What do you do with someone that is a superstar, but they just don't fit?
Yeah, there's two options, right? You you try to coach them first, and then if they don't drink the Kool-Aid, you cut them. It's as simple as that. And look, I know in the corporate world, there's a few more hoops that you need to jump through to make that happen. But what I found in my experience is if someone's not fitting, they're generally having a bad experience themselves, and the tough conversation gives them a level of certainty. You know, you sit them down, and rather than just have all these things left unsaid, you get them in the room, you say, look, our intent was that you were going to be this. It hasn't gone the way that we would have planned. Let's have a conversation around parting company. Now, they might be midway through their contract. And so that was something I faced in the first year I got here, is that there were a couple of players that didn't really seem to be happy at the organisation anymore. They weren't connecting with the coach. I think I had 2 and 3 years respectively left on their contracts. So you might have to eat the shit sandwich financially, you know, but you're better for it in the long run. So we strike a deal with those players. We part company, and there's every chance, and this is what you're going to have to accept, is that those players are going to go somewhere where they do fit and, you know, play their best football. And the optics of that is, well, you know, the last organisation must have been ordinary because they've gone somewhere else and they've worked. You know, I'm ambivalent to that stuff, and we might talk about that a bit later, but, you know, we work in an industry that's got this really rich, deep, exaggerated narrative wrapped around it. That's the other thing, is that if you're making a decision for the right reasons, is you can't be concerned about how it's going to be interpreted by people on the outside of your business. But for us at the core, when we're managing our list and we apply the same philosophy to staff, if we get a sense that there's friction, if connection between individual and organisation isn't what it needs to be, then we are absolutely prepared to have the tough conversation and go our separate ways.
I like that, right? Because I think at the end of the day, you know, leadership's not easy, right? Everybody wants to be liked, but at the end of the day, you're there to do a job. And I think, you know, what you're saying or resonating with me is you've got to be brave, you've got to be honest, and you've got to be courageous to rip the Band-Aid off and have that conversation, right? So,
listen, Rudy, I'll just cut in there. Like, if anyone's on the call and, you know, thinking that this is easy for anyone here, it's not. Having the tough conversation, like I've got, you know, 30 young guys here, I'll say it again, who play a brutal collision sport, who can end up in the fetal position in a dark room sucking their thumb because of what some anonymous troll says about them on social media. So I don't care who you are. No one likes to have their feelings hurt. I don't care who you are, unless you're out and out sociopath. Having the tough conversation with someone, saying they're not up to standard or we've got to go our separate ways, should never be easy, ever. You know, and once you reconcile with that, then you just become more prepared to do it. You know, you don't avoid it because it's going to be tough. So that is reminded to me every other day when I see someone who plays in the middle, who beats people up for a living, have their sense of self completely destroyed by someone who's operating from a dark room.
I really like what you said in terms of preparation. I think for leadership, it's the same thing, right? Being able to have, you know, the difficult conversations is that 5 Ps, you know, which is prior preparation prevents poor performance, right? Which is, you know, if you prepare to have these difficult conversations and take the emotion out of it, you know, you come with a certain level of backing and knowledge that you can and are motivated to have this discussion. So, yeah, I think that's really valuable advice there, Ben. I know I'm just checking the clock here. I've got a couple more questions for you before we throw over to the audience. What you mentioned, drinking the Kool-Aid, right? So how important is the onboarding process? Because, you know, in many ways, you know, we're set at home and we think, you know, shouldn't these players just be grateful for being selected, you know, and do everything they can to just simply fit into the club? So, you know, how important is that process from the club side to make sure the onboarding process is effective?
Our onboarding process never stops, is the truth. Is because we operate in player market, so an employee market that's so fluid and fast moving, and one of the forces that acts on our system from the outside is the player agents, right? Is that our players are turning up to work every day looking for chinks in the system, particularly if you're not winning, right? So I guess what would normally just be an onboarding process where you bring people in and introduce them to other staff members and show them around the club and sort of that, you want to do it well to get them to sign. But if we're not delivering on our work environment that creates that player experience, the players very quickly pick up the shortcomings in what you're giving them. They'll start to talk to their agents. They'll still start to talk among themselves, and they'll look sideways really quick because we've effectively got a core constituency that has a 10-year lifespan as an employee. If things are going well, they're trying to maximize their time in the game always. So they want to be in great systems. They want to be learning. They want to be growing. And as I said before, ultimately they want to be winning. If you're not giving them that, if you just, pour on the syrup at the start, and then it just diminishes, then, the negative contrast from the onboarding to the day-to-day means that they'll want out real quick. So it's beholden on everyone in our program to make sure that we're turning up every day. And this is where sport is really good and maybe business can learn from, is that those people that work in those business units that ring fence the players, our entire focus is on people. Every single day, our future depends on creating a work environment that people love, that are helping people grow, so that when they get to Sunday afternoon, those same people win. We're not making a product. All we're doing is creating an environment for people to perform at their absolute best. And if that drops off, they'll pick up on it, they'll talk, and all of a sudden you're starting to get phone calls from agents. So the onboarding, Rudy, it never stops for us.
I really like it actually, because we can almost change the word from onboarding to, I'm not exactly sure what, but as you were talking, I was looking at your model, right? And what was screaming to me is repetition around your vision, standards, system of accountability, values, and so forth. It's that outside in model that consistently needs to be at the forefront of everyone's mind by the sounds of it.
Look, I've had this conversation with Kevy, right? He leads our football program, and it's a huge burden that he carries. But everyone, so that the 30 staff and the 36 players there, everybody in that box is watching everything he says and everything he does all of the time. So he sets the tone for all the people that sit in those bubbles around the playing group. If they don't feel engaged, if they don't believe, if he doesn't make sure that all those parts are connected, that's why I've got the arrows pointing into the players and between each of them, is that it will impact on the player experience. It's just the reality of the industry that we work in, and there's any number of forces that are kind of proving to be distractions that are undermining what you're trying to do. So leadership and courage to lead is paramount.
I think that's really great advice, right? Because for anybody on this call, whether you're a CEO, senior manager, mid-manager, all the leaders that are responsible for teams, your team members are looking at you at all times. And I think what's really interesting, as you were talking, went back to my psychology days, which was there's this thing called mirror neurons. And, if you've ever walked down the street and someone randomly you walk past has a smile, you end up smiling too. So your employees constantly is reevaluating their emotional state based on what's happening for that leader at that point in time. So it is a tough position because you're constantly on show, constantly on display, but you've also got to be, you use the words at the start, extremely self-aware of what you're doing. So I think that's definitely got to be one of the takeaway messages from this session. Ben, we've got 5 minutes left. Actually, we've got a couple of questions for you about your current role. So You've been in this job now for 2 years. What have you learned? What's worked for you? And what has been some of the hard lessons you've learned and things you would do differently?
Process is easy. People are not. Yeah, we work in an industry with a lot of exaggerated forces that tend to create exaggerated behaviours. And my personality type is I like straight lines. Rugby league, and it's probably true for life, is just a whole bunch of squiggles. And so I've gone from trying to be a person that makes order out of the chaos to getting closer to becoming someone that finds rhythm in the chaos. Yeah, being able to sort of adapt, because as you can see, what's on the screen there is how my mind works. And so what I've had to get more comfortable with is that these things are just big, broad concepts. How things play out, how they get executed, is going to be dependent on different personality types who control different parts of the program. I have to accept that, not everybody in the football program at the Broncos sees the world exactly the same way in all areas. That as long as we're kind of connecting around a few core principles, then I just have to give enough space for people to express their own creative style. That's the one thing I learned from Wayne Bennett. Wayne's a magnificent leader and a really strong personality, got great strength of character. But as a coach, if you can imagine the game plan as a canvas, is that what he does is he'll kind of paint part of the canvas, work really hard to teach the painter, how to stroke, what colours to use, what are the core fundamentals, but essentially he leaves space on the canvas for the individual to finish the painting. So for me, having come out of a really small closed system, working on a TV show for 10 years, I'd lost the muscle to adapt to people who are different to me. So coming back over the last 18 months is about not expecting people to be as explicit as I am about how we do the work. Just kind of having some good open conversations about the intent of what we're trying to do here, and then effectively guide, then step aside.
And what about, for our audience members who potentially aren't leaders, but I guess we're all team members or team players of some sort. What advice, over years of playing a team sport, what advice can you give our audience members on how to be better team players and have a positive impact on our colleagues?
Yeah, we had a sign up at the Bronx for years that said, and you've all heard it, I've got no doubt, it's amazing what can be achieved when no one cares who gets the credit. But I think the world's changed, particularly in terms of how we communicate with each other, where we're more self-centered, self-interested, self-righteous. It's no one's fault, it's just happened. And so you can sometimes forget that the best experience is the shared experience, and that being able to serve a larger purpose, or be part of a group that's chasing a shared goal, is more fun than just achieving your dreams in your little vacuum. And that just means you need to be self-aware, is that you don't beat yourself up when you realise you've made it all about you. You just kind of remind yourself that sometimes you're not always going to get what you want, and that being part of a team and achieving something with the group can be just as fulfilling.
Well, I really like that last bit, actually. The last bit where you say, when you realise your ego has probably driven your decisions, that's okay, you can do better.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing with being self-interested and self-obsessed and self-righteous, is that we beat ourselves up a lot. I see that in a lot of people here, as I have a lot of conversations with staff and players here who, and this is this is a high profile industry with a lot of people watching and having an opinion about who you are and what you do. Insecurity is high, which means trust is low, and that's as true for the individual as it is the group. That if you can just find your way to thinking as much about the team and what you can give to someone else, it becomes, as I said, there's a real contentment in that. But it has to happen on purpose. You know, none of these things are a happy accident. We've sort of fallen into these bad habits based on all the technology that's kind of shaped our thinking and our behavior. So to get yourself back to having other behaviors, it takes again a bit of courage, and it has to be deliberate. It will not happen by itself.
Ben, this was really, really interesting and fascinating. I'm just going to switch gears here a little bit around our Q&A, see if we've got some questions from the audience. Chris, do we have any? Okay, it's a question for you, Ben, from Matthew. Where do your values, standards, and visions derive from? Top down, bottom up, or collaborative?
This set of values for the organisation was born out of the playing group. So what we did was understand that rugby league is our core business. It's a unique one. You've heard me say a couple of times now, brutal collision sport requires a certain psychology that doesn't always reconcile well with, you know, how we operate on what we call level 2 here, which is our commercial community admin team, right? It's down here, there's just a completely different mood between the two elements of the business. Not that we're constantly striving to keep it connected, we are. But if you walk into the football department, you're going to feel very different about the organisation than if you go straight to level 2 or the boardroom, right? So we thought, based on that, the players got together. They understood that we don't want 2 franchises. We want a whole organisation buying into these values, but it had to come from them. So Kevy took the players on a journey. They come up with the 4 values: so respect, resilience, compete, and mateship. Respect and resilience being the kind of cornerstones, and they were then shared with the staff in the commercial and community teams and adopted, because, you know, there's a part of everybody, doesn't matter where you work at the Broncos, no matter what job, what department, that is here because we love the club and we love the game.
I think if it's just a top-down approach, you run the risk of disenfranchising people too, because they don't buy into it, right? I think if it's a bottom-up or a collaborative approach, then at least the discussion was had, and then there's more opportunity for buying. Now, sure, you know, not everybody's going to have the exact same 4 values, but at least the discussion was had, and you know, people have connected around it. So yeah, I think it makes perfect sense. I've got another question here from a person called V for you, Ben. How do you deal with resistance to change from existing team members when you are a newly appointed leader from outside?
I kick cans. I wallow in self-pity. I do it in private.
Yeah.
You know, because, you know, if I've got an idea that I think is backed by evidence and is going to take us in the direction we need to go, then everyone should buy into my idea immediately, right? I'm being facetious, of course.
Yeah.
So when it doesn't happen, I have the same human reaction to everybody as everybody. I get frustrated, and then I just sort of find some time to work through the process and then understand it's not the strongest or the smartest. It's the people who are most adaptable that kind of get done over time what needs to get done. And so for me, if there's someone senior here who is resistant to change, I just have to embody one of our values, which is respect, and understand that they potentially see the world a little different from the way I do at the moment. There might be things going on in their job or their life where they just haven't got capacity to move. So I'll have to accept that even though that is a good idea, now is not the time to introduce it. It takes a lot of patience. Yeah.
And what about at a team level, right? So that's you as an individual, but how do you, at a team level, manage resistance to change? So I think, someone coming out from external that's a leader, and the team, kicks against the prickles, or, dig their heels in. How do you bring the team on the journey?
Well, they may not be ready. Just because I'm ready, and I think that's where we should move, doesn't necessarily mean that we've got to go there, because, there's this whole issue of absorptive capacity to take into account, which is, the ability of a firm or an organisation to embrace new information in order to change. And if absorptive capacity is low for the team, because someone's not ready to learn, someone's not ready to move, there's too much uncertainty in the environment already to drive more change. There could be any number of reasons. Then, I just have to accept that if there's pushback, even though I believe in the idea, that the timing is poor. And again, not to say that the idea is wrong, but then as the leader working with the team, you then have to say, okay, well, now I know that today's not the day, or this week's not the week. Doesn't mean when things change, when we're in a more of a positive frame or a different time of year, that I can't revisit that. I think that's just the adapting part of being a leader and helping an organisation evolve. It's not always going to happen on your terms.
I think that's interesting, right? Because you're kind of coming from the angle that your industry is a very fast-paced industry. So standing still and always at that point in time where there is resistance, to stand still and address it might not always be the option. Sometimes it's saying to the group, by the sounds of it, tell me if I've got this wrong, is, guys, we've got a job to do, and we're under pressure. We've got to do it now. We will come back to it and create space to have this conversation. But right now, let's drop our individual differences and let's do what's best for the team, what's best for the club. Did I understand that correctly? Because it's a very interesting dynamic, right? When you are so under pressure, whether that be week in, week out, or, from media scrutiny.
Yeah, you nailed it. There's a lot of urgency injected into what we do because of the public narrative. Absolutely. And so our issue isn't so much driving change. Our issue is, let's not get too reactive, particularly when things aren't going well on the field, is that there's this kind of capability, stability balance at play, good people working together towards a shared goal, even if capability isn't exactly where you need it to, just by the mere fact that they're connecting over time, is that they get better together, and so from a coaching perspective, this would be the issue that Kev and the coaching staff have to face, is that, 3 losses and we've got to throw the game plan out the window, but that's not always the case. When you've got a lot of people on the outside having a commentary about what you're doing, sometimes that can prove a distraction to the point where it actually affects your decision making. So growing and evolving here, not a huge issue. Some of the more scientific academic stuff that, I tend to go down rabbit holes with, I've got to be careful how I introduce. But our issue from a football perspective is making sure that as the forces act on the people, the exaggerated forces act on the people, particularly the senior people, is that they're not constantly reacting, because then the players will pick up that that's happening, that the message is inconsistent, that it creates more uncertainty in the environment, and that just immediately undermines performance.
Again, I think it's very much the fact that, as you already spoke about, the leaders on a constantly surveillance, right? Whether by the team, other functional heads, or the media. So I think that self-awareness is really key. I do have a final question here from Tom. When you join a new organization, how do you pulse check where things are at? How do you do that?
Well, I guess if I look back now, I probably spent too much time when I arrived at the Broncos looking at how we did things before I kind of started to understand in more depth the people that were doing them. So I would spend more time, if I had my time over, getting to know the people, the leaders in particular. Whereas I found myself coming out of a small closed system where my focus was 90% on the work, the writing and producing of a show, and then hosting the show, then going home and doing it again, only having to deal with 3 or 4 people, to come here rather than taking deep dives into budgets, org charts, position descriptions, policies, processes, is that I would just get to know the people, because it comes back to that sort of capability connection thing, right? Is that, who did I hear it framed up? I think it might have been that Patrick Lencioni, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. I heard him on a podcast once talk about the healthy smart balance, is that if you prioritize smart over healthy, it can get real toxic real quick. Whereas healthy organizations where people are connected, understand and appreciate each other and what they bring, they get smart over time. And so I got there eventually, but it wasn't my first instinct when I got here. So that was the big lesson for me, is developing the people muscle again. So if I'm going to sense check anything, I'm going to get around and find out who the people are in the organization that I'm working with, what they stand for, how they operate. And then I would have had less opposition to some of the things I wanted to introduce, because I would have been better at how I introduced them.
I think that's interesting because, you were drawing earlier the distinction between, being technically good at your job versus the toughest part, which is the people part. And I think, so often when we are recruited and selected and hired for a job, you're hired for a very specific job. So you jump into it, and I know this from experience too, right? You jump into a new role and, you want to impress, and, it's all about what technically you're good at. But sometimes, well, as you say, all of the times, actually, you should spend time with the hardest thing, which is the people, because they're the variance. You can't really control all that well. So I think that's fantastic advice. And I think you're not the only one. I think everybody suffers from that when starting a new role. So look, Ben, thank you so much for your time with us today. It's been incredibly insightful. I've enjoyed it very much. And for me personally, I think elite sports and the corporate world actually face very similar challenges, with the key difference, of course, that in elite sport, there is the added pressure of constantly being under the magnifying glass, having to perform week in, week out at the highest levels. So culture, team dynamics, are a lot more on display. But at the same time, I think, business needs to operate with that same level of urgency, that same level of drive when building work environments. And I'd say especially in the current economic environment. And I think for me, the other thing that really stood out is that some of the tactics and strategies that you were talking about are the exact things I think modern businesses need to hear today and learn from. Specifically moving away from that old traditional, HR or business models, from trying to control people through systems and processes too much and policing people, but to put people truly at the center of the company and its goals and aspirations, and essentially use those systems and processes to guide people. So I think these are some of the key things that I've taken away from it. I really appreciate your time, and I'm looking forward to doing some more work with you.
Just one thing before I go to everyone, it's a message I try to give myself is just be kind to yourself. It's a hard world out there. We had an academic come in who'd done 8 years worth of research on team collapse, present to some of the staff here last week. It was fascinating stuff, but the epiphany that I had inside of the presentation, as Vanessa was presenting to us, was that the best teams win 75% of their games. The best teams complete 75% of their sets, which means the best teams are failing 25% of the time in my industry. So get good at failure, because we all do it.
And comfortable, right? Comfortable
Yep.
to learn. Yeah. Thanks, Ben. Also, just
Pleasure.
quickly just want to talk about this workshop that you can see on your screen here. This is a follow-on from this session. So it'll be a very practical hands-on session that I will run. There's only limited spots. It is a free session, so use the QR code, scan there to join up. Very small, intimate setting. There'll be a couple of sessions that will run purely because of a small setting. So register now as these spots will fly off the shelf. So if you're interested in the next part of this workshop or next part of a webinar, please sign up. So Ben, once again, thank you very much, and look forward to watching your career unfold even further.
Thanks, Rudy. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.